Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Red Room Stories. I know many of you tune into these tales to help you drift off to sleep. So, before we settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. The wind howled through the dense, ancient forest, carrying with it a chill that seeped into the bones of anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in its grasp. The trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to lean inward as if whispering secrets to one another. Beneath the canopy, the moonlight struggled to penetrate, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters on the forest floor. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its cry echoing unnaturally, as though the sound itself was distorted by the oppressive atmosphere. No one dared venture into these woods after dark, for the locals spoke of things that lurked there, things that were not of this world. It was on such a night that Clara found herself walking alone, her flashlight flickering weakly in her trembling hand. She had taken a shortcut through the forest, ignoring the warnings of the townsfolk, convinced that their stories were nothing more than superstition. But now, as the trees seemed to close in around her, she began to regret her decision. The air grew heavier with each step, and the silence became so profound that even her own breathing sounded deafening. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest, but the path ahead seemed endless, as though the forest itself was conspiring to keep her trapped. Suddenly, the flashlight died, plunging her into complete darkness. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She fumbled with the device, desperately trying to revive it, but it remained stubbornly lifeless. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she noticed a faint glow in the distance, a pale bluish light that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Against her better judgment, she moved toward it, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a clearing where the trees stood in a perfect circle, their branches intertwined to form a natural archway. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, its back turned to her. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and jointed in ways that defied human anatomy. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a sickly gray, stretched taut over its frame like parchment. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both grotesque and mesmerizing. Its eyes were hollow pits, yet they seemed to pierce through her very soul. Its mouth stretched into a grin far too wide for its face, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. It raised a clawed hand, beckoning her closer, and though every fiber of her being resisted, she found herself stepping forward. The air around her grew colder, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was alive. The figure's grin widened, and a low guttural sound emanated from its throat, a sound that was neither a laugh nor a growl, but something far more sinister. Clara's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but logic had no place here. This was something ancient, something that existed outside the boundaries of human understanding. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped, suffocated by the oppressive weight of the forest. As she drew closer, the figure began to change. Its form wavered, shifting and contorting as though it were made of smoke. The air around it shimmered, and for a brief moment Clara thought she saw countless faces swirling within its body, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The figure reached out, its clawed fingers brushing against her cheek, and she felt a searing pain as though her very essence was being drained. Her vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to dissolve into darkness. When she awoke, she was no longer in the forest. She lay on a cold stone floor in a room that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The walls were lined with strange symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the light she had seen in the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was so absolute that it felt like a physical presence. Clara tried to stand, but her body felt heavy, as though it no longer belonged to her. She looked down and gasped. Her skin was pale and translucent, her veins dark and prominent, as though something had drained the life from her. The figure appeared again, materializing from the shadows as though it had always been there. It circled her slowly, its hollow eyes studying her with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. Clara tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but her voice was gone, stolen by whatever force had brought her here. The figure leaned in close, its breath cold and foul, and whispered something in a language she could not understand. The words echoed in her mind, twisting and distorting until they became a part of her, seeping into her thoughts and memories. She felt herself changing, her body contorting in ways that mirrored the figure's unnatural form. Her skin stretched and cracked, her bones shifted and snapped, and her mind was flooded with images of places and beings that should not exist. She tried to resist, to hold on to the last remnants of her humanity, but it was no use. The figure had claimed her, and she was no longer Clara. She was something else, something that belonged to the darkness. The last thing she saw before her vision faded completely was the figure's grin, wider and more grotesque than ever. It reached out, its clawed hand resting on her forehead, and she felt a final, searing pain as her consciousness was extinguished. When the light returned, she was no longer in the stone room. She stood in the forest, her body whole and unbroken, but she knew that something was wrong. The trees whispered her name, and the shadows seemed to follow her every move. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was no longer human. She was one of them. The townsfolk never saw Clara again, but sometimes, on the darkest nights, they would hear a faint, guttural sound coming from the forest. Those who dared to investigate would return with stories of a pale, gaunt figure lurking among the trees, its hollow eyes watching them with an unearthly hunger. And though they tried to convince themselves that it was just their imagination, they could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The forest had claimed another soul, and the darkness had grown stronger. The old house at the edge of town had stood abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under the weight of time. No one dared to go near it, for the stories surrounding it were too horrifying to ignore. It was said that the house was cursed, built on land that had been tainted by unspeakable acts. The townsfolk whispered of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, and of faint, anguished cries that seemed to emanate from within its walls. Children dared each other to approach the property, but none ever made it past the rusted iron gate. The house loomed like a silent sentinel, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of civilization. One stormy evening, a young man named Daniel arrived in town, seeking shelter from the relentless rain. He had been traveling for days, his car breaking down miles from the nearest town. The locals directed him to the only inn, but it was full, leaving him with no choice but to seek refuge in the abandoned house. They warned him against it, their faces pale and their voices trembling. But Daniel dismissed their fears as mere superstition. He was a man of science, a skeptic who believed only in what he could see and touch. The house, he reasoned, was just an old building, nothing more. As he approached the house, the rain intensified, the wind howling like a wounded animal. The iron gate creaked open with a groan, as though inviting him in. Daniel hesitated for a moment, a chill running down his spine, but he shook it off and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, to reveal walls covered in peeling wallpaper, and furniture shrouded in dusty sheets. The house seemed frozen in time, as though its former occupants had vanished in an instant. Daniel explored the ground floor, his footsteps echoing eerily in the empty rooms. He found a staircase leading to the upper level and decided to investigate, his curiosity outweighing his unease. The stairs creaked ominously with each step, and the air grew colder the higher he climbed. At the top of the stairs, he found a long hallway lined with doors, all of them closed. He opened the first door, revealing a child's bedroom. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, but the room felt anything but welcoming. A doll sat on the bed, its glassy eyes staring directly at him, and a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing his flashlight. In the darkness, Daniel heard a faint sound of child's laughter, soft and melodic, but tinged with something unnatural. He fumbled with his flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it remained dead. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the hallway, and he felt a presence behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder still, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He backed away, his heart pounding, but the laughter followed him, growing more distorted with each passing second. Desperate to escape, Daniel ran down the hallway, but the doors began to slam shut one by one, trapping him. The laughter turned into a scream, high-pitched and filled with agony, and the walls seemed to close in around him. He reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood ajar. He pushed it open and found himself in a large, dimly lit room. In the center of the room stood a figure, its back turned to him. It was a child, dressed in a tattered nightgown, its hair matted and unkempt. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both innocent and horrifying. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Daniel tried to back away, but his legs refused to move. The child stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, and the room seemed to warp around it. The walls bled a dark, viscous liquid, and the floorboards cracked and splintered, revealing a void beneath. The child reached out, its fingers long and bony, and Daniel felt an icy grip on his wrist. The touch burned like fire, and he screamed as the child's face contorted into a mask of pure malice. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a deafening shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Daniel's vision blurred, and the room dissolved into chaos. He saw flashes of images of family gathered around a dinner table, their faces frozen in terror. A man in a dark cloak performing a ritual. A child crying in the corner, its tears turning to blood. The visions overwhelmed him, and he felt himself being pulled into the void. The last thing he saw was the child's face, its grin widening as it whispered something in a language he could not understand. When Daniel awoke, he was lying on the floor of the house, the storm still raging outside. His body ached, and his mind was clouded, but he was alive. He stumbled to his feet and ran out of the house, not stopping until he reached the town. The locals took one look at him and knew what had happened. They tried to help him, but Daniel was no longer the same. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, his eyes wide with terror, and he would mutter incoherently about the child and the void. The house remained standing, its presence a constant reminder of the horrors that lay within. And though Daniel never returned, he could not escape the feeling that something had followed him out of that house. He would often catch glimpses of a small figure in the corner of his eye, its black eyes staring at him with an unearthly hunger. The townsfolk avoided him, fearing that the curse had taken hold of him as well. And as the years passed, Daniel grew weaker, his body and mind slowly succumbing to the darkness that had claimed him. The house still stands, its windows dark and its walls crumbling, but those who pass by swear they can hear faint laughter echoing from within. And on the stormiest nights, when the wind howls and the rain lashes against the windows, the figure of a child can be seen standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. The curse of the house lives on, and it is only a matter of time before it claims another soul. The wind howled through the jagged trees, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky like skeletal hands. In the distance, a crumbling house stood alone on a desolate hill, its windows dark and hollow, staring out like empty eyes. Ethan trudged toward it, his boots sinking into the muddy earth with every step, the weight of his decision pressing harder than the cold air against his skin. He had heard the rumors about this, place whispers of vanishings, of shadows that lingered too long, but desperation drove him forward. His sister, Clara, had disappeared 3 weeks ago, and the last clue was a scribbled note with this address. He clutched the paper tighter, its edges worn from days of handling, and pushed open the creaking gate. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sour stench of decay, as if the house itself exhaled rot. The floorboards groaned under Ethan's weight, protesting his intrusion with sharp, splintered cries. Faint light trickled through cracked windows, illuminating peeling wallpaper that curled like dead skin. He called Clara's name, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence, leaving only a faint echo to mock him. A staircase loomed ahead, its steps sagging and stained with something too dark to be mere dirt. He hesitated, his breath shallow, but the thought of Clara trapped somewhere in this forsaken place spurred him upward. The second floor was a maze of narrow hallways, each turn revealing more decay doors ajar, hinges rusted and walls streaked with unreadable scratches. Ethan's flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the floor, twisting into shapes that seemed almost alive. He stopped at a room where the door hung crookedly, revealing a child's bed draped in tattered lace, its mattress sunken and stained. A doll sat propped against the pillow, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing, the other staring blankly at him. He stepped closer, unease prickling his skin, and noticed faint scratches on the floor too precise to be random, too fresh to be old. A sudden thud echoed from deeper within the house, sharp and deliberate, like a heavy footfall on wood. Ethan froze, his heart hammering against his rib, the flashlight trembling in his grip. He strained to listen, but the silence returned, heavier now, as if the house held its breath. Moving toward the sound, he passed a mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, its surface clouded with grime yet for a moment. He swore he saw movement behind his reflection. He spun around, shining the light into the empty hallway, but nothing stirred. Swallowing hard, he pressed on, the thud repeating, closer this time, urging him deeper. The basement door waited at the end of a corridor, its paint chipped away to reveal splintered wood beneath. Ethan's hand hovered over the rusted knob, the air growing colder, his breath visible in faint clouds. He turned it slowly, the mechanism grinding as if reluctant to yield, and the door swung open to reveal a steep, narrow staircase descending into darkness. The smell hit him first something wet and metallic, mingling with the rot that permeated the house. He took a step down, then another, each creak of the stairs amplifying the dread coiling in his gut. At the bottom, his light caught the glint of something wet on the stone floor. The basement was vast, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with jars, cloudy glass containers filled with murky liquid, and shapes he couldn't identify. Ethan stepped closer, his beam illuminating one jar where a small, pale hand floated, its fingers curled as if reaching out. His stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat, but he forced himself to keep moving, scanning the shadows for any sign of Clara. The thud came again, louder now, vibrating through the stone, and he turned to see a figure standing in the far corner, a silhouette too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but Ethan felt its gaze boring into him. He whispered Clara's name again, his voice cracking, and the figure twitched, a sharp, jerky motion that sent a shiver down his spine. The flashlight flickered violently, plunging the room into intermittent darkness, and in those brief blackouts, the figure seemed closer each time the light returned. Ethan stumbled back, his heel catching on something soft, an old blanket, he thought, until he looked down and saw a shoe peeking out, a shoe he recognized. Clara's shoe. His knees buckled as he pulled the fabric away, revealing her coat, torn and stained, but no body, just the empty shell of her presence. Panic seized him, and he swung the light back toward the figure, but it was gone, leaving only the echo of its presence in the stale air. The thudding resumed, rapid now, a relentless rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ethan ran for the stairs, his flashlight dying completely as he reached the first step, plunging him into absolute darkness. He clawed his way up, the wood scraping his hands raw, the sound of his own ragged breathing drowning out the thuds, till he realized they weren't thuds at all, but footsteps, heavy and uneven, following him. Something cold brushed his ankle, and he screamed, scrambling faster. Back on the main floor, he bolted for the front door, the house groaning as if alive, its walls tilting inward to trap him. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that vibrated through his bones. He yanked the door open, tumbling into the muddy yard, the cold air stinging his lungs as he gasped for breath. Behind him, The house stood silent once more, its windows dark, but he felt it watching, waiting. He didn't look back as he ran, the note with the address slipping from his pocket, fluttering to the ground unnoticed. Hours later, soaked and shivering, Ethan stumbled into a diner miles away, his story spilling out in frantic bursts to a skeptical waitress. She listened, her expression unreadable, then slid a cup of coffee toward him without a word. He drank deeply, trying to steady his shaking hands, but the warmth couldn't erase the chill that had settled into his core. The waitress glanced out the window, her eyes narrowing at the horizon where the hill loomed faintly in the distance. She muttered something under her breath too low for him to catch before turning away, leaving him alone with his haunted thoughts. The next morning, Ethan returned to the hill with a police officer, determined to prove what he'd seen, to find Clara or whatever remained of her. The house stood as he'd left it, decrepit and silent, but the basement was empty, no jars, no figure, no sign of Clara's coat or shoe. The officer sighed, chalking it up to exhaustion or a trick of the mind, but Ethan knew better. He felt the house's presence, its malice seeping into the air, mocking his failure. As they left, he noticed the front door creaking shut on its own, though no wind stirred the trees. Days passed, and Ethan couldn't shake the nightmare's visions of the figure. Its head tilted, its limbs too long, standing over him as he slept. He stopped sleeping altogether, pacing his apartment, replaying every moment in that house, searching for answers. The police dismissed his calls, the waitress avoided his questions, and the note he dropped was gone, swallowed by the hill. But one night, as he stared out his window, he saw Ida's silhouette on the street below, too tall, too thin, its head cocked unnaturally. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. The hum started again, low and insistent, seeping through the walls of his apartment, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan backed away from the window, his heart racing, the room spinning as the sound filled his skull. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, clutching it like a lifeline, but the hum only deepened, vibrating through his teeth, his bones. The lights flickered, and in the brief darkness, he heard footsteps low, deliberate, climbing the stairs to his door. He locked it, barricaded it with a chair, but the knob began to turn anyway, the metal groaning under an unseen force. When morning came, the apartment was silent, the door still locked, the chair undisturbed, but Ethan was gone. His knife lay on the floor, its blade pristine, untouched by blood. The window stood open, curtains fluttering in the breeze, though no one could explain how he'd left through it from the third floor. Down the street, a neighbor swore she'd seen a shadow moving away, too tall to be human, its head tilted as it vanished into the dawn. The police searched, but found nothing, the case filed away as another mystery. The house on the hill remained, its windows dark, its silence a lure for the desperate and the curious. Locals avoided it, whispering of those who entered and never returned, their stories fading into legend. Ethan's name joined the list, another lost soul claimed by whatever dwelled within those walls. The wind still howled through the trees, carrying faint echoes of footsteps and a low guttural hum, waiting for the next visitor to step across its threshold.